Hello and welcome. This is Founder Lee Roon, Fantasy Grounds College. Today I have a video about Fantasy Grounds Unity DnD5e, and this has to do with the anatomy and the breakdown of NPC stat blocks. Quite often people want to create their own or modify NPCs. I believe that NPCs and items are probably the most difficult aspect of creating content within the specific rule set and the platform. And mainly because it's tedious a little bit and that there's a lot of misunderstanding on how it works. So I'm hoping to help clarify some of that and show you guys some things that maybe you didn't know. Some of you might know already, but you might want a little refresher. So without further ado, I'll get going. So the first thing I want to talk about here is I have in my library just the SRD loaded. So no fancy plugins or anything like that. I have the options window open because we want to show you how this is going to affect some of the things that you do with your NPCs on the combat tracker at the end. And then we're going to actually put together a real small setup here and kind of explain what each one of the things do within the given stat block. And we're going to use an adult red dragon because they have quite a bit of stuff to go over. So we'll use something that's a little bit more complex instead of just a goblin or something. So one of the first things you'll know is when you first open up Fantasy Grounds and you have your library open and such, your modules activated, you need to go to the options menu and from there go to sidebar and then activate the rest of the sidebars that you'll need. Mainly you want to be in game master mode. You won't necessarily need the player creation stuff, so that's something that you'll set that up first. And then for as far as like the NPCs, once you have content loaded, you click on the NPC banner, it opens up your list of NPCs. Right now this is selected to everything, but if I go to the drop down and just select the bestiary, it kind of narrows it down a little bit. You don't get as much extra stuff in there. And the thing that we're going to look at is the adult red dragon. So I'm going to pull this red dragon up. I have a nice bookmarked here. One of the first thing you'll notice is, it has all this stuff on there. Well, what does all this mean? So we're going to go through that. And the other thing is, how do you modify or create something? So we're not going to build NPCs. So this is going to take too long, but we're going to take something and kind of give you a tool or a platform to work off of so that next time you have to come up against this, you're not going to have as much issues. So without that in the way, I'll take this stat block, and if you'll notice on the very top right up here, there's a little pink kind of read-only thing, and that is from the fact that the NPC, in this case, is attached to one of the modules. So we need to make a copy of that, and that's pretty simple to do within Fantasy Grounds. So what you're going to want to do is pick whatever item off the list that you want. So in this case, it'd be the adult red dragon, which I have here bookmarked. And when I say bookmarked, I have this little shortcut that I drag and drop down to these hotkeys. That way they're easy to find so I don't have to dig through the list again. So now what I want to do is drag and drop this dragon into the NPC area. No pun intended, dragging the dragon. So now that we have that, we want to look for this dragon, and it is called the adult red dragon. And if you look carefully here on to the right, it's not attached to any book anymore. So I'm going to close the original, and I'm going to open up the copy. So the reason I made the copy is so that you can create and delete and modify the existing NPC stat block, because before you couldn't unlock it. So now we can unlock it, and you'll have all these different text fields and such, and we're going to break those down now. So without knowing much, or if you haven't ever done this before, the stat blocks can be a little bit challenging at first, depending on what you're working on. Different rule sets are different, so I apologize if you're using like Pathfinder or one of the other rule sets. They are similar, but the wording's going to be different because obviously the rule set itself is different. So first thing is we're going to go to this blue area up here on the top left, and this is your title and the name of the data. So this is an adult red dragon. This is a copy. So what we could do here is take this, and first I want to get rid of copy. I don't need that anymore. And then for adult red dragon, I'm just going to put red dragon in the non-ID name area. So this will make it to where the red dragon is basically, that's how it's identified instead of its actual name or its age or anything. And then maybe this dragon has a a proper name. So what I'm going to do is we'll call him Flame Face. That's his nickname, and then comma adult red dragon. So what this does is when I add this dragon to an encounter, and then I add the encounter to the combat tracker, it will not show the actual name. It'll only show this non-ID name, so it'll just say red dragon. So if I lock this and I add this with this little non-identifier on, I'm going to add this to basically to this encounter. And the reason why we add these two encounters is so that at the end of a game or such, it will also calculate the CR level and the XP, but also it makes it easier to divide all your XP and such with your players. So we're going to add it to an encounter. So encounter can be made, you can make your own, or you can use existing ones and modify them depending on what you're doing. I called it Red Dragon Attack. So I'm going to go ahead and drag and drop this down into here. So there's the Red Dragon. It says Flame Face, Adult Red Dragon. You have the non-ID specified there. So as the Game Master, you'll see the real name. But this just lets you know that the non-identification is on. This little helmet or the next symbol is your faction. So if you want them to start off neutral, you would change it to neutral. Or if you want them to start off hostile no matter what, change it to red. Faction, you just leave it that way. And when you drag and drop it into the combat tracker, it will take on the actual alignment of the creature based on the alignment instead of any specific disposition. And then there's friendly. So we're going to start it off as faction. And then as far as the CR level goes, you click that little round swoosh thing there, the arrow, and it's a CR 17 challenge rating, and it looks like it's worth 18,000 experience. So once you have your encounter built, you just lock it. And this will take on whatever changes that you made before you added it. Now, at this point, you need to understand that if I add this dragon to the combat tracker, and now it just says Red Dragon up here because of the non-ID name. But if you were going to add this later, or if you added or adjusted anything to the stat block, you have to change everything all the way through. You can't just change one thing and not the other. So in other words, if let's say I assigned it something different here, maybe I changed the name or something, whatever it is, I need to fix this encounter, so delete the entry on here, and I need to delete the one on the combat tracker. So this would be done before your session. So then if you make any changes or alterations, then you want to bring it back here and then refresh it again just in case. And you could change the quantity to 2 if you wanted. Maybe you have a mated pair or something. And then you lock it, and then you pin this to whatever you want. So I'm going to take and drag and drop this down to the hotkeys on the bottom so I don't lose it. And when you hit this down arrow, it's going to add the dragon back on. That's the proper way to update something if you've made changes after the fact. I don't know how many times I've done this to myself where I've made adjustments or changes to one of these or the other, but I didn't change the combat tracker, so it still had the old characteristics. So they won't change this combat tracker unless you delete it and re-add it. That's something you need to know, and that's true of most data in Fantasy Grounds. So that's how you basically use an existing creature. You make a copy of it, you unlock it, you can change the token, you can change the hit points, you can mess around and give it different actions, or maybe you want to change the spells that it has, whatever it might be. You do that up front, then you add it to the encounter, then you add it to the combat tracker, and then from the combat tracker you will add to the map. So that is basically how you want to do this in this order. Now you can stage the attack so that it happens, and it's all set up so you can actually drag the individual token onto a map first. Then when you close this encounter, it'll disappear off the map. And then when the person or the players get to that point, you hit the down arrow, it sets it up on the combat tracker. The token or wherever you set them on the map will show up. So that's the other way to do it. So one's more of a planned route. The way I described initially was for basically like a one-off or some kind of unplanned encounter, maybe a random encounter. Or maybe this is something that you roll to see if they show up, and it's one of those things. So that is basically how you handle that. So you take an existing stat block, make a copy, unlock it, put it on the basically in your encounters, then add the encounter to the combat tracker when it's applicable, like right before your session or when it's time. You can set it over there, and then it'll be on your map if you've already pre-allocated it to a location, and you'll be ready to roll. So that's just the one basic thing you need to know how to, make your own kind of modifications. And like I said, if you want to change the token out, this is how you do it. So I'm going to go ahead and lock that temporarily. I'm going to close the encounter and move this over. And we'll go down to this next thing. So we did the non-ID. That was this common name for just a red dragon. It was very basic. You didn't get the full actual name or the type of dragon, or even the date or the age of the dragon. So there's younglings, there's all different kinds, different phases of dragons, and they get more powerful as they get older. So if you guys have any questions, go ahead and ask. Just kind of going through this to help people out. So the next thing is, when you are working on a stat block, you need to understand what all these different fields do. And that's one of the things I kind of wanted to break down for you. A lot of this information is there already. You just got to know where to find it. It's in the D&D wiki. There are also some tools that I'm going to include in the links, which will allow you to create NPCs with different third-party tools if you don't like doing it in Fantasy Grounds or you like a quicker way. But I think it's best that you learn how to use Fantasy Grounds first and then start adding all those fancy tools and utilities. Because if something goes wrong or breaks, you're not going to know how to fix it. So that's something that you got to keep in mind. So I'm going to unlock this. So first thing we have is size. So size determines the size of the creature. When you're making tokens, when you have a small or a medium creature, you just want the token to be about 100 by 100 pixels square. When you go with a huge, you're going to probably make it 4 by 4, and that you want to have at least 300 by 300. If it's a large creature, you want it 200 by 200. And anything above 300 is ridiculous. So this thing, if it was gargantuan, it changes the number of squares that they occupy in a map. So when you stick this dragon on top of a map, it will change according to this size that's allocated and set in this field. So this actually affects the gameplay. It affects reach, and it affects the map, like how many squares does this actual creature inhabit in regards to the scale of the map and such. So that does matter. It does affect things. So when you're creating monsters or you're modifying them, if you need to change them, just remember it changes some things on the maps as well. So that's something that you're going to have to get used to. But small and medium creatures usually only take up 1 square. This dragon here is going to take up 4, and so or actually 6, because he's a huge. He's not large. So a large would take up 4. He's going to take up like 6. So the other thing is the alignment. So alignment sometimes matters, like when you get into spells. If you have like a wizard or something that casts a spell that attunes itself off good and evil, or a better example would be a cleric. Quite often they'll cast protection from good, protection from evil. So if you don't have that in there, if it's blank or if you didn't spell it correctly, it's not going to parse that spell correctly. So just be careful with that if you're adding alignment. Make sure it's spelled correctly and make sure there's something in there. So if this was a chaotic neutral dragon, that spell wouldn't do the spellcaster very well. Wouldn't do him very good. But in this case, if he casts protection from evil, and this dragon has to be evil, then the benefits of that spell will work. So make sure that you have alignment in there. Now, your armor class is usually just something you have to look up. It's not automatic. So this number is a natural number. It's probably a combination of his dexterity, his armor that he has on his skin. It says natural armor. Add a dexterity bonus, which he doesn't. That could be added in too. So these are pretty much manual. There's no rhyme or reason for it other than you're going to have to look it up to see what the base armor is. And then you're going to calculate in, if applicable, the dex bonus for the AC. So that's up to you how you want to handle that. But basically, the numbers need to come from either the stat block description, or you need to make it up and look at a chart or a table to know what armor class or what armor rating you get from each armor type. So you might have an NPC that has a shield and a set of, maybe they have chainmail. So you'd have to know the base number plus 2 for the shield. So you would put in parentheses, you would probably put chainmail, comma, or plus shield, and then dex bonus if you have one. So in the case of heavy armor, you'd probably only get 1 or plus 2. So hit points is kind of interesting. You have a formula. This is 19 12-sided dice plus 133. So this number comes from a couple different things. One, it has a D12 for its actual hit die, and you would roll that 19 times and calculate all that together. But this plus 133 also has to do with its level and its proficiency bonus. So that's what this plus whatever number is on the end. It's usually tied in with the level or with their hit dice. It adds bonuses to their hit points as they escalate in power and to get more hit dice and such. And there's tables and formulas in figuring that out. Also listed here is 40-foot movement, 40-foot climb, 50-foot for flying. So these don't really do anything mechanically in Fantasy Grounds. They're more or less a note. There's nothing that's going to restrict your players or yourself from moving this creature too far away, or moving it basically in a direction that's further than it should move. So that's something that you have to judge at the table. There's no limit or anything that's going to stop you from moving tokens or the NPCs to a region beyond what it can normally move. So Fantasy Grounds normally doesn't limit things. So that is going to have to be played just like you would around a table. There's nothing limiting you other than sight and the actual terrain that you're in, knowing the rules and such. So that's something that is more of a note, but it should be in there so you have an idea of what their movement rate is. So they do much better flying, obviously, but they can climb and move pretty well at 40 feet. So the stats are based off of a number of things. Normally you would start with 8 on every single one and do like a point buy if it's like an NPC or a humanoid. If it's more of a monster, in this case this is a dragon, they're going to have a lot larger stats, and that's based off the monster manual, or in this case the SRD. But there's nothing stopping you from modifying this a little bit to kind of reflect a more unique build on a specific dragon type. So maybe his strength is only 25, so I can change that, but I'm going to up his dex to 12. And that gives him a +1, so that would change his AC to 20. So these are things that you have to do manually. You kind of have to have an understanding of the rules. And you also have to think about balance. So before you change those, I mean, you noticed I took 2 away from strength. I added 2 to dex. There's kind of a balance there. Not a very good balance, but at least there's some there. And then all these other stats, if you wanted to move them up or down slightly, I don't think that's a problem. It's when you start actually going way outside the range, then you might want to consider a different type of dragon or a whole different creature. So it really depends on what you want to do with your NPCs. So the next field is a saving throw. So these appeal when you are actually making saves off of your character or your NPC. So in this case, when I lock this, there's a dex save bonus. So if I roll a dex save, which is this little S at the bottom, it's going to add the 6 with it. So this helps with the roll itself. So you roll the 8, got 6, it was a 14. So these numbers automatically will apply to saving throws with the D20. So if you have to make a death save, or not a death save, but like a con save or something like that, it will automatically add in those modifiers. And those come from a couple different things. It could be magic, but it's also your traits. It could also be from your class or whatever it is that you're closest to. Like spellcasters might get a better intelligence save or something like that. So that's where that comes from. The skills are just added arbitrarily for for certain gameplay things, depending on what game style you play and how deep these NPCs are. You rarely use these things. I mean, I use them, but not that often. Like perception, definitely use that. So I would roll that in the dice tower, be a hidden roll, and then I would roll that against maybe in this case someone trying to sneak around and get his treasure. So he rolled a 19 because that's 13 added to the 6. So that wouldn't be very good for someone trying to hide. Stealth is another thing. They are kind of sneaky for their size, so they might fly overhead very quietly. You might add a disadvantage to that because of a wind, or maybe they're moving through trees or something. So we'll just say the passive perception average on the party is 11 or 12. We'll say it's 12. So I'm going to roll the stealth, and if this beats the roll of 12, then they're in good shape. What do you know? He rolled 11, so he would have been detected by the party. So a lot of this stuff is situational. You still have to resolve it manually. Your senses do make a difference now as far as vision goes. Your immunities are set to where you only take half damage from whatever immunities. In this case, this dragon is immune to fire, but you could put ice or force if you wanted to. Just depends on what you're doing. And same thing with resistances and vulnerabilities and condition immunity. So all those things will automatically do what they need to do in Fantasy Grounds. And that's the one thing you have to learn about the rule set is, which stuff is automated, which stuff needs to be handled manually, which stuff is just on there for notation. That's the sort of thing that brings a better understanding to the rule set and the platform. When you're first starting, it's hard to remember all that stuff. It's kind of better off just going with what the stat block has. But as you get more familiar with the rule set and with Fantasy Grounds, you'll see all these different options open up to you. So your senses, you have blind sight, dark vision, and your passive perception of 23. So these two, blind sight and dark vision, will change how the token views the battlefield or the battle map. So there are effects in the newer version of Fantasy Grounds. If you've been around for the last couple months, you know that they've added the new lighting feature. It's out of beta. It's part of the program now. If you want to add those manually, if they're not listed properly or you're missing something, you can actually take these conditions, or you can make your own lighting effects. So in this case, maybe they didn't have darkness or something enabled, so you can drag and drop that onto their stat block. So I don't have that coded right now because it's a standard NPC trait. But if you wanted to say that this old flame face is going to hold a torch, or use this darkness spell, or maybe he just has a little candle, who knows. So you can drag and drop this onto the creature or the NPC, and it will add the lighting effect when you're on the map. I'm not going to go through all that because that's a whole nother situation there. But just to let you know that does make a difference, the senses. Languages basically are just going to key off of the chat window. If you want this dragon to speak common, you can change the speaker up here, which is this top right, and then you can say something like in common. Change this to say common here. So he says, "Hello, thieves." But then if you wanted to switch it to Draconic, then you would just manually change this to Draconic, and he would say the same thing, but it would be in Draconic. And if you don't have the language, you don't get the translation. Only the game master does, and the person who has the language. So that's basically kind of a manual thing. It's more or less, oh, this guy can speak these two languages. It's listed on there properly, and you switch the speaker and you use the chat feature in here. You can change that, and you get the gibberish or the uncoded sentencing. So you have your challenge rating and XP. So there isn't really anything built into Fantasy Grounds that calculates that for you. So if you were going to build something from scratch and you wanted to know its challenge rating and XP points, there are plenty of different websites that help you with that type of calculation. Sometimes you can guess a little bit if it's really close to the standard creature. It just really depends. But it all gets calculated in, like their stats, their hit points, how many special abilities do they have, all that stuff factors into the difficulty rating. So then below that, this is when you start actually building the creature, and this is where spelling and the wording is very important. So there are resources in the chat that I'm going to leave for you for the parsing. So for instance, this legendary trait, when you add the trait, you'd click that green plus button and you would give it a name. And in this case, they chose to add this 3 per day because that's the amount of times they can use it. This is just a manual process. It says, if the dragon fails a saving throw, it can choose to succeed instead. So if he fails and he wants to use the legendary action, you have to just let the player know, don't roll a save, he saves automatically. I mean, that's all there is to it. There's no automation to that. That's more or less a note, and it comes from the rules for that, so that's what that is. So not everything is automated. The multi-attack gives them a note that says, hey, this is how this creature attacks. In this case, it says it can use its Frightful Presence. It will then make 3 attacks. So it has a kind of a fear thing going on, and then it has 3 different attacks. It will bite, and it has its 2 claws. So if that's what you want to do, then that's fine. The tail attack can be put in place of the bite, I believe. I don't think it's the one and all, because you have your bite, your claws, and a tail. The tail attack definitely has some serious damage to it. It's usually pretty devastating. And you have different things. You have piercing from the bite, you have slashing from the claws, and you have bludgeoning from the actual tail. So you got 3 different things going on here. Plus this fear, this Frightful Presence is basically like fear. So when they are afraid, when they fail a saving throw, basically, and if you go to the effects up here, you would basically take frightened and drag that over to your players, and that would give them the benefit or the penalty of whatever this condition, depending on the situation. So it just kind of depends. Some people are immune to that, or you might be a dragonborn or something, and maybe you're born with not being afraid of them, whatever. So this is the Prideful Presence here, what I'm talking about. It says you have to succeed on a DC 19 Wisdom saving throw. So that means that you have the ability to drag and drop this on one of the allies, and if they save, in this case they roll a 20, that's a critical success. So that means whoever this went against, that person saved, and it dragon's presence doesn't bother them. And you can use it for 24 hours after it's used. So if a creature's saving throw success for the end of the turn, the creature is immune to the dragon's Frightful Presence for the 24 hours. So it's only a one-time thing, which kind of balances it out. There's another thing that shows recharge. So this recharge 5 through 6 is important to have here. And then the description is just for Fire Breath. But this gives you the range The type of damage, is it a cone? There's a saving throw. It's a dexterity saving throw with challenge rating of 21. So it's very hard to save. Then you have 63 dice or 63 points of damage or 18d6 fire damage. And if you fail, you take the full on thing. If you only take a half damage if you save. So these are parsable. So a lot of this is the wording. If you notice, I highlight over that. That means it's parsing. It's actually, there's some syntax or some actual verbiage in here that will trigger this. So you have a saving throw for Prideful Presence. You have the condition if they fail. And then you have all the notes here. Same thing with this fire breath. You have the recharge, which it will automatically recharge. So if you're in the combat tracker and you use this, Fantasy Grounds will know that. So if you go to the offensive section here and you use this actual fire breath, it knows if I use this, it will know that I've actually utilized that, and it will reset when it on its next turn. It will roll, and if it rolls a 5 or a 6, that means that it recharged. So that's a cool feature in Fantasy Grounds. It's automated. It's the recharge on a weapon or an attack. And then you have these legendary actions. You don't see these very often, but mainly on higher level creatures, such as this dragon. The dragon makes a wisdom perception check to detect things. You can take 3 legendary actions, choosing from the options below. Only 1 legendary action can be used at a time at the end of another creature's turn. So you have to stagger these out. And then the tail attack is a legendary attack, so that's when you can use that. Or you can do the wing attack, which they flap their wings and all this stuff gets blown around. They get knocked over, and the dragon can fly up to half its flying speed at that time. So they can kind of hover right there and make things hard on you. So there's all kinds of things that go into making NPCs. The main thing is knowing that you can unlock them and that you can modify them as needed. That way you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can create them from scratch, so if you didn't want to use a template, you can go into the NPC area and open up the NPCs, and then I actually have a group made, so I'm just going to, you'd make a group up here if you want to make custom creatures, and then you just click this green plus button on the bottom, and that gives you your overview of your stat block. And then at this point, you would plug in your data or your values. Now, there are third-party products out there that make this process simpler and a little easier. So if you want to make your own and look for those, there's Fantasy Module Parser, there's the NPC Maker on the DM's Guild, and then, of course, there's the tutorials online that Zacchaeus have made that I also linked in the video description, so that you're able to tackle this manually and kind of get a grasp on it before you start using a bunch of tools. Because then you're not going to know if something's broken or not and that sort of thing. So this is kind of your anatomy of this stat block. And then on the other tab is where you could put notes. Quite often they'll link a picture of the creature. You can link tables or parcels or whatever you want on the back of the creatures. So it's convenient. So if you have your treasure right here, and if this creature summons minions, you'd have a little encounter here in case, and then you'd have your lore and description and some artwork. You can do quite a bit with NPC stat blocks. So that's just some heads up on that. But basically, there's some things I wanted to show you in the options here, and that changes the way that this functions in regards to when you add the NPCs to the combat tracker. So I'm going to go ahead and cover that. So I'm going to come back with the adult red dragon, and I am going to just make this to where I have 3 of them instead of just 1, so I can show you the variation. So here's the encounter called Dragon Attack. So I'm just going to change that to 3. So there's 3 of them. But that's one group. So that's not going to help me show what I need to show. So there's one group. And then I'm going to add another dragon on. Maybe it's a female or... So instead of an adult red dragon, maybe we have an ancient red. So there's the boss, and then the minions, we'll say. When I've added that, I'm going to go ahead and refresh, and now it's a CR28 challenge rating. You got 3 dragons and a big boss, or a big mama dragon. So now what we have is this NPCs attached to this encounter. So when this encounter is going to go, when you hit the down arrow, what you're going to notice is all these smaller dragons go on the same initiative, and they all have the same hit points. That's because they're treated as a group. So when you add them from here, it's going to treat them as a group, because in the combat GM area, it says add, and then auto NPC initiative is set to group. So if you want it to be, where you roll yourself, you can turn it off. Or if you just turn it on, what will happen is, I'm going to go ahead and delete these off the combat tracker. So I'm going to hit down, and I'll click this again. This time they should all have different, most of them should have different initiatives. Yeah, so we have a 20, 16, 14, 9. And they're random, so they're not, not predictable. So that's one thing you can do to kind of make this a little bit more realistic. Instead of going in big piles or big groups of creatures, you can change that, but it's set to group by default. So, until you get familiar with the rule set more, you might want to leave it for a couple games to get used to it. There's a numbering system, so if you drag this over and we go ahead and set this back into the combat tracker, notice it'll say, has this dragon, and it'll be 1, 2, and 3. So it appends the actual numbering. You're going to turn it to random, and what that'll do is freak your party out. So let's see what happens now. So when I put this on the combat tracker, now it's saying 3, 5, 4. So there's at least 5, but you only see 4 of the dragons. So the numbering kind of scares the group. It fools them into thinking there's more or less than there really is. So that's for the variable. And then you can also have a fixed, a off. You can turn that off. So now the NPC rolls, fixed or variable. So what that does is I'm going to take and add the NPCs back again. But what this does is it changes it to either a fixed or variable number. And that's the number on the stat block. I'll show you that in a sec. So when I add these in, what this means is that when they attack, this number here in the attack rolls, there's a number that's set. It's like 14, and then it has 46 damage. So the 14 is an average roll. So if you have that set to variable, it will roll. If you have it set to fix, it'll use the fixed number. So this is up to your game master, but this is a good way to control how much damage these guys do. But it's always the same damage every time if you have it on fixed. And then variable is, like I said, that's the random part of it. So that's something that affects your NPCs is when you add them to the combat tracker, the settings. The next thing is the hit points. So if I add all those creatures, they're all going to have the same hit points if they're in a group. So I'm going to hit the down arrow, but before I do, I'm going to change the hit points. You can go with maximum or random. So I'm going to go with random. So now when I add them, they shouldn't all have the same. Yeah, so 263, 259, 230, 555. So you run the risk of them having really high hit points or really low, but at least there's some randomness to it. And then you have the initiatives are all different because I left that setting on. I left that on to on instead of group, so they don't go all at the same time. So these are things that are also affecting the gameplay, is the settings and the options and how you want the NPCs to interact with the combat tracker. So you can set this up to be random, and there's a couple other settings in here. One is the movement on the map. You can change that. You can also change the basically if you want them to roll initiative on every round, you can turn that on. There's all kinds of little options, but those are the main ones that I showed you. So if you've ever ran an encounter and you get tired of them being the exact same roll every time, you can change the settings. So I think that's good enough. I've rambled on enough. Hopefully this is helpful for you, and that when you go in the future to create or modify NPCs, you'll find the video and it'll help explain what all that stuff is. Pretty much this anatomy here is kind of like you have your bit title, you have all your main data, secondary data, and then all this tertiary stuff. Then you have your challenge rating and XP, and then you have all your traits, reactions, legendary actions, lair actions, innate spells, and spells. And one thing I want to say about spells is those can be difficult to add. So there's tutorials on the spellcasters because they're a little bit different when you add and take away spells. So take care, everyone. Have a good night, and I'll see you around in the community. And don't forget that at the end of the month, we're having our Founders Day weekend. It's our 4th annual event. We're going to have Satine Phoenix and her husband, Jameson Stone, and that's Sunday. And then Saturday, we're going to have the Digital Dungeon Master and the owner of Smiteworks, Doug Davison. So hopefully you guys can make